Zephyr is one of the most versatile and powerful frames in the entire game of Warframe. Don't believe me? Then watch this video until the end and I am sure you will agree. I will show exactly how to excel in playing Zephyr, how to approach modding on Zephyr, how you acquire Zephyr, and I will share multiple fully fleshed out builds that you can copy and paste to quote unquote dominate Steel Path. But first, let me just give you a glimpse of what the winged fury of Zephyr can actually do. Zephyr is one of the easiest frames to acquire in the entire game. You can get her via your clan's dojo, where you can find every part that you need to craft her entire set. If you're looking to get the prime variant of Zephyr instead, you can either trade with other players or wait for Varzia to bring her around during a prime resurgence. In general, Zephyr Prime brings you some marginal benefits like 30 extra base armor, 75 extra base energy, 0.05 more sprint speed, and an extra Madurai and Vesrin polarity. This might save you some forma, however it will not change your general playstyle on Zephyr or power level in any significant way. As for Zephyr's lore and theme, there is not really any deep-going integrated lore in the game for her. She was originally designed by Liger Inuzuka, who also designs most of the best looking deluxe and heirloom skins in the game, and she is based on the Greek god Zephyrus, who was said to control the western winds. One of the more interesting factoids about Zephyr is that she's actually the first frame to receive a passive ability, as these were not part of the game before she was released. This nicely also segues me into the next part of the video, where I will do a deep dive on Zephyr's passive, as well as all of her other main abilities. Her passive, while being introduced a long time ago, is still a very powerful one. It's able to buff weapon critical chance by an additional 150%. This 150% is gained while being airborne, which you can do by either aim gliding or by just jumping up in the air. This 150% is also additive to other critical chance mods, which means that in some cases you can forgo using critical delay or point strike, which is pretty handy. Besides this, Zephyr also has increased maneuverability while being airborne, and the western winds make her extra floaty, decreasing the gravity she experiences and making her able to stay in the air for longer. Her passive actually nicely synergizes with her first ability, Tailwind, which can be split into two different components. First, we have the hoverglide cast that you can get by hold casting Tailwind. This will summon those western winds right under your butt to keep you floating in the air, and is actually quite nice as it also triggers aerial damage reduction mods while simultaneously increasing your evasion for enemy bullets. Do keep in mind that after 1 second this will cost 5 energy per second to keep active, and opposed to what you would expect, does not count as a channeled ability. This actually makes Tailwind the only pseudo-channeled ability in the entire game. And this fact also enables a bug that I will cover later. And also prepare for it to be fixed after I release this video, as by now I'm quite certain I am on DE's watchlist. Anyhow, while hovergliding, you can move around horizontally but not vertically. You can also speed up this gliding movement by using your keybind for sliding, which will give you a small movement boost. Besides the hoverglide cast, you can also do a Divebomb or an air dash by tap casting the ability instead. To perform an air dash, simply tap the ability button and you will fly towards where you are aiming at a speed of 30 meters per second base, which can be increased by modding for ability duration. When air dashing over enemies, you will knock them down and deal 750 base slash damage in a 2 meter base radius, which can both be increased by modding for ability strength and ability range respectively. I can definitely recommend air dashing in open worlds, as it's a nice way to travel around if you do not have an Archwing deployer unlocked yet. And then, when you are up in the air, you can also tap cast Tailwind to dive bomb down to the ground like a missile, which is nicely accompanied by some excellent sound design. To dive bomb successfully, you have to look down to the ground within a 45-degree angle. Important to note is that the modded impact damage, as shown in the ability's tooltip, will scale with the so-called activation height of the ability. This happens via this formula that I found on the wiki, where you can multiply the base damage by the activation height in meters and then by 0.2. I should also note that casting Tailwind while airborne will be 50% cheaper than if you cast it while on the ground. And this will apply to your final energy cost, meaning that if your ability costs more than the 25 energy base, by for instance using a mod like Blind Rage to increase it for instance to 37.5, casting your Tailwind while being airborne will now halve from 37.5 to cost 18.75 energy instead, ultimately rounding up to 19 total energy being spent. In the end, Tailwind is a pretty nice ability that blends movement, evasion and damage into one ability. Then for Zephyr's second ability called Airburst. Again, this ability can be cast as a tap cast and as a hold cast. Hold casting will fire the Airburst projectile that pushes enemies away from the point of impact, and tap casting will pull enemies together and group them up. This is also Zephyr's subsume ability, which means that this ability can be put on any Warframe in the game using the Helminth system. Grouping up enemies with Airburst will put them in a ragdoll state, which is important to know for some niche synergies with the electric status damage and subsume ability from Temple called Pyrotechnics. Both grouping or dispersing of enemies occurs in an 8 meter base radius, which can be increased by modding additional ability range. The projectile that you fire with Airburst will count as weapon damage. This means that it's actually affected by arcanes like Arcane Arachne for buffing its damage. Arcane Avenger will be able to give it crit chance, and it can even proc viral status effects when using Nourish. Then besides this, you can also increase the damage even further using Mirage's Eclipse or holster mods like Holster Amp and Vigorous Swap. The projectile deals 500 base damage, scaled by ability strength with a 50% status chance. This 500 base damage is distributed as 18.75% impact damage, 12.5% puncture damage, and 68.75% slash damage. Besides this, the ability tooltip mentions a damage growth per enemy. This damage growth is capped at 35%. This growth also increases the damage of the Airburst projectile when it passes through enemies. So to take advantage of this mechanic, it's advised to group enemies up first and then fire another Airburst through those enemies that will all be combined into some weird looking meatball. Overall, the strength of Zephyr's Airburst does not lie in its damage output, but rather in the utility that it provides. For instance, something that a lot of players do not know about Airburst is that it's able to force the lifted status effect on enemies when using the Funnel Cloud's augment. Usually, this augment removes the lifting functionality from the base ability, but as I just said, you can rescue this by using Airburst. Finally, just like Zephyr's first ability, Airburst will have a 50% cost reduction when it is cast while airborne. This then brings me to Zephyr's third ability called Turbulence. Compared to Zephyr's other abilities, this might be her most straightforward ability, but by no means the worst one. Turbulence is able to make you practically immortal as it bends away projectiles and even lasers. This happens in a 6 meter range at base, which can be increased by modding for ability range. The duration of this ability is 20 seconds at base and should definitely be increased with some extra ability duration mods, as you cannot recast the ability while it's active. So make sure you keep an eye out on that ability bar to not be surprised by enemy gunfire immediately taking you out of the skies. Turbulence, modded for extra range, can actually be a really good way to defend squishy defense objectives like excavators or defense targets that move around, as you can deflect any bullets that come in the vicinity of the objective. Keep in mind that having negative range, by for instance using narrow-minded, could hamper the defense Turbulence provides, as you could catch projectiles by flying into them face first. Turbulence will also not offer any protection from melee attacks and AoE damage, which luckily can be avoided by staying up in the air whenever possible. Finally, we have Zephyr's fourth ability, which is called Tornado, and this ability is all kinds of broken and spaghettified. I made an incredibly in-depth video on Tornado, which you will most likely have seen already, but if you haven't, I definitely recommend watching it. As for this video, I will keep the Tornado description relatively short, as I do not want to bloat up the entire video. Tornado can be cast as a hold cast or a tap cast variant again. The tap cast of Tornado spawns 3 tornadoes randomly around enemies in the vicinity, which it is then able to pick up and throw around. These tornadoes are also called wandering tornadoes as they randomly roam around. They can, however, be somewhat guided with your reticle by aiming where you want one to go. The holdcast ability of tornadoes will instead spawn tornadoes around your reticle at the place you are aiming. Here they will remain static while also picking up enemies that are susceptible to crowd control, placing them in the middle of the 3 spawn tornadoes. Now let's quickly go over the tooltip. Tornadoes will last for 20 seconds at base, which can be increased by ability duration. There will always only be 3 tornadoes that spawn with the base ability. Tornadoes are able to deal impact, puncture and slash damage every 0.25 seconds to enemies within 10 meters. The range mentioned in the tooltip can be increased with ability range and only affects the range in which tornadoes are spawned when tap casting the ability, or the range in which tornadoes are distributed around your reticle when hold casting the ability. The range in which enemies are affected by the tornadoes, however, is always capped at the previously mentioned 10 meters and is absolutely fixed, so using mods that might cause a negative range value, like narrow-minded, will not have any effect on this specific range. When tornadoes are shot, all damage including status and crit chance is duplicated to enemies affected by said tornado. Additionally, enemies will take ×2 final crit damage from these tornadoes, making high crit weapons on Zephyr absolutely excel. This also offers a nice synergy with her passive that increases the crit chance of all of the projectile and hit scan based weapons, as I've mentioned before. To cut it short, all you really want to do is cast Tornado, shoot Tornado, and enemies captured by those tornadoes will gain the death status effect. If you, however, want all of the nitty-gritty, make sure to check out that Tornado video. You won't regret it, and it will help you make more sense of the builds that I will feature in this guide. Now it's time to talk about something different, which is augment mods on Zephyr. And she has actually quite a few of them. First, let's start off with the augment mod for her first ability called Target Fixation. Target Fixation is a ridiculous augment, even though it might not look like it at first glance. If we look at the description of the mod, we can see that it will reset both the double jump and bullet jump after casting Tailwind, which can be pretty nifty to offer some more maneuverability throughout missions. However, where this mod begins to go crazy is in the second part of the description, where it states that hitting enemies with Tailwind will increase its damage by 100%, resetting after remaining on the ground for 2 seconds. Using this augment basically turns playing Zephyr into a small minigame of the ground is lava. However, the last part of the description of this augment mod is a bit disingenuous, as wall latching or even being an arc wing will also count as being on the ground, resetting your buff. One way we can circumvent losing the buff, however, is by using our operator. If you go airborne with Zephyr and swap to your operator, you will get to keep the buff, as the game considers Zephyr to still be in an airborne state. You can then use this to hack consoles, revive teammates, or kill ghost forms of Thrax units in Void Cascade. Now, the reason why this augment is actually insane is because the 100% damage increase that it gives per enemy hit will scale infinitely, meaning that given enough time and playing enough The Floor is Lava, you will be hitting damage cap numbers at some point in the mission. Finally, there's also still a bug in the game, which is now more than a year old, so at this point you can consider it a feature. You can use this bug or feature, or however you want to call it, to keep the target fixation buff indefinitely, even when standing on the ground. To do this, you need any rank of Arcane Steadfast. Then you need to trigger Arcane Steadfast by hold casting your Tailwind ability so you float. You can see whether Arcane Steadfast is triggered in the top right of your screen. If you are able to trigger Arcane Steadfast with a hold cast of Tailwind, it will cause your dive bombs to cost 0 energy, and it will allow you to keep the target fixation buff. To be honest, don't ask me why this exactly works. I think it has something to do with the nature of it being a pseudo-channeled ability, but all I know is that it does work. And oh yeah, even as a cherry on top, nullifier bubbles will not reset your buff either. So yeah, with the absolutely broken state that target fixation is currently in, you can use this for the easiest level cap runs of your life. Next up is the Airburst augment mod called Airburst Rounds. Airburst rounds will increase your secondary weapon damage per enemy hit by Airburst by 40% for 14 seconds, scaling with modded ability strength and duration respectively. This damage increase is capped at 500% and will function as a Hornet Strike mod, meaning it's additive and not multiplicative to base damage increases. The bonus is able to be refreshed by hitting at least one enemy with Airburst before the buff runs out, keeping the highest value active. Finally, this augment is able to provide extra damage to some, but not all exalted secondaries. For instance, Hildrin's Balefire Charger, Dante's Noctua, and Jade's Glory will get increased damage from Airburst rounds, while for some reason Mesa's Regulators and Titania's Dex Pixia won't get any of the Airburst round buffs. Then for Turbulence we have the Jetstream augment. Jetstream is a pretty simple augment that does two things for you and your allies that get in range of your Turbulence ability. Firstly, it increases your movement speed, and secondly, it increases your projectile speed. Both of these values will scale with your modded ability strength. Allies that leave your Turbulence range will keep the buff for 3 seconds, which sadly cannot be prolonged in any type of way. Projectile speed might seem a bit useless, but it can actually be quite useful on a number of weapons. For instance, thrown melee weapons like glaives have a certain base range based on their projectile speed. Using Jetstream, you can greatly increase the range of your glaive throws, but also speed up the time it takes for them to return to your hand. Then, if you have something like a shotgun, projectile speed will actually increase the effective damage range of this shotgun. If I, for instance, increase the projectile speed with Fatal Acceleration on this Kufa Sobek, you can see that the fall of range updates in the arsenal. Finally, on any other projectile-based weapon, it can help eliminate the need for you to lead your shots, since the travel time towards the target becomes significantly shorter. Then I introduce to you Funnel Clouds, which is the next augment for Zephyr's Tornado ability. I've already mentioned this augment mod a couple of times, and it's another totally busted one that I run practically on all of my Zephyr builds. As I said before, damage done to tornadoes will be replicated to enemies within range. Normally we get 3 big tornadoes, but Funnel Clouds will turn this into 11 smaller tornadoes that, however, can still replicate the damage that's dealt to them. This means that we can deal pretty much 11 times as much damage as we are putting out by using Funnel Clouds. Where this gets really crazy is when we start using the Blast status effect and AoE weapons, as these both will help cause some cross-chaining effects that can sometimes even get recursive damage to occur. The only downside of this augment would be the loss of functionality of picking up enemies and collecting them. However, as I said before, this can actually be circumvented by putting enemies in a ragdoll state, which can be achieved by using Airburst. Finally, there's also an augment for Zephyr's passive called Anchored Glide. This augment will make it so that you do not have the floatiness that Zephyr usually has, and it will give you a small 15% ability strength boost. If you are not a fan of how Zephyr normally feels, you can consider using this augment. However, personally, I feel that once you are used to how Zephyr moves, it is not a problem at all, and this augment becomes a wasted mod slot. Next, I actually want to talk about the Helminth system for Zephyr and some of the notable subsumes that she can use. The first and arguably most powerful subsume ability that you can put on Zephyr is Zata's Whisper. This is mainly due to how it synergizes with blast damage and Zephyr's tornadoes, giving you a multiplicative damage increase based on the amount of enemies affected by tornadoes. Combining Zata's Whisper with an AoE weapon modded for blast wipes the floor with any kind of enemy and is incredibly powerful. For more or less the same reason, a Zephyr with Thermal Sunder and the Thermal Transfer augment can be very handy to have. This is because the Thermal Transfer will be able to give you a source of blast damage on your weapons by combining Thermal Sunder's cold and heat damage effects. For a melee platform Zephyr, you can consider using both Shock with the Shock Trooper augment or Wrathful Advance to increase your critical chance. Shock Trooper can be especially nice if you want to make sure that you can always use melee influence. This is because the electricity from Shock Trooper will never combine with any elemental mods on your weapons, thus enabling melee influence. Then, in general, Silence is also a great option on Zephyr, especially for builds that try to exploit the infinite damage potential of the Target Fixation augment. Silence will make it so that you have practically nothing to worry about, as Turbulence will deflect any projectiles, and Silence will disable Eximus and Acolyte abilities. Tempest Barrage from Hydroid can also be especially powerful, as the damage that rains down can be replicated if you cast it into tornadoes. Combined with the Viral Tempest Augment, this causes enemies to become incredibly weak like a wet paper towel, but in most cases they will just get their lives ended from this ability synergy itself. The final specific subsume that I can recommend is Pyrotechnics from Temple, which I already briefly mentioned. Pyrotechnics can hit enemies multiple times whenever they are in a ragdoll state. As both Tornado and Airburst are able to put enemies in a ragdoll state, you are able, together with Archon Vitality, to put an absolute insane amount of heat procs on enemies. By then using Heat Inherit, which I explained in my damage type video, you can get millions of damage on enemies within seconds. Now, besides these more specific subsumes, you can use whatever ability you find provides you with more comfortability. Usual meta choices include stuff like Nourish or Roar, which also work more than fine on Zephyr. However, I personally enjoy using more niche choices that enable some cool synergies, as I've exemplified. What I often see players complain about when it comes to Zephyr is the general floatiness of her gameplay. However, proper movement technique and understanding of tile sets and flowing movement makes this a non-issue in my eyes. While you can use Anchored Glide to disable this floatiness effect, I feel like this wastes a mod slot on Zephyr. Instead, I will try to guide you through how I move as Zephyr myself, circumventing the issue of floatiness. First off, her passive gravity reduction can actually be beneficial in tile sets where you have to cross large gaps in level geometry, for instance on the Jupiter tile set or in open worlds. Secondly, if you need to make sure you get back to the ground quickly, you can chain slams or heavy slams for a rapid and aimed descent. This is what I use all the time as Zephyr if I want to pass through a door and I am floating too high. Instantly chaining this slam into a roll will cancel the slam animation, after which you can perform a new bullet jump and aim glide to zip across the map. Alternating movement combos of bullet jumping, slamming and rolling can easily solve the floatiness issue, as it will keep you close to the ground at all times. While this will take some time to get used to, mastering this movement flow will increase your overall movement speed, not only on Zephyr but on other frames as well. Another problem I see players having with Zephyr is that due to a lack of understanding of her kit, most people don't know how to adjust their builds to different mission types. While some mission types suit Zephyr more than others, her versatility is unmatched. Okay, I will admit I don't often pick Zephyr for spy missions, but still. In faster mission types, like Exterminate, you can cast Wandering Tornadoes to pick up enemies, and by slamming into said tornadoes, you will usually eliminate an entire group of enemies that are floating around. Besides this, you can consider using the Airburst and Pyrotechnics abilities I discussed earlier to group up and dispose of enemies very quickly. For any missions with a defendable target, which in Warframe is actually quite a lot of modes, Zephyr is an excellent choice. First, she's able to lock down an area around the objective with her tornadoes, and secondly, her Turbulence ability will reflect all projectiles as long as you position your Warframe close to the objective. Especially if you have modded for increased ability range, this can be a lifesaver on missions like Excavation with defendable targets which are incredibly squishy. And to reiterate, this ability saves yourself from projectile-based attacks as well, so glass cannon builds on Zephyr are actually quite competitive. Then, in endless missions, you can use the borderline exploitative damage combos that I exemplified in my Tornado video. These combos will easily deal more than enough damage to wipe the entire map all the way up to level cap and beyond. Especially the bugged state of the Target Fixation augment is incredibly chill to use for endless missions like Void Cascade. Finally, in boss runs, Zephyr is absolutely goated, as her damage replication via tornadoes means that she can often insta-kill most bosses, and for some at least up to the phases where they become invulnerable. And finally, as I mentioned earlier in the video, Zephyr is incredible in open worlds where she can roam around the skies like the winged fury she is. Next, I want to take some time to talk about Zephyr and Tauron strikes. Tauron strikes are newly added operator abilities that deal scaling damage to enemies. These abilities can be incredibly powerful and can help elevate builds to new levels. I made a video on Tauron strikes before, so check out that one if you need more info on them. However, for this video I will just suggest some synergies that Tauron strikes are able to provide for Zephyr. One synergy that's very powerful is when you combine the use of the Tauron strike from Thara, which is the bow you unlock from the Madarai focus school, with Wandering Tornadoes from Zephyr dealing damage to enemies which are outside of your line of sight. The Rain of Arrows perk from the Meteorite Tauron strike will trigger when enemies are damaged by any of your abilities or weapons. As Wandering Tornadoes are outside of your line of sight, this enables you to damage enemies with the Rain of Arrows perk, which you cannot usually hit or see. And on top of this, enemies captured by the tornado and hit by a new arrow of the Rain of Arrows will also replicate that damage via the tornado again. On high levels, this allows a single cast of Wandering Tornadoes to wipe the entire area around you. Another good choice for Tektolyst weapon and Tauron strike is the Unairu hammer called Cogron. The Tauron strike from the Cogron will give Zephyr a bunch of extra sustain via universal orbs and also provides up to 2250 armor, which can be used to trigger arcanes like Primary Bulwark, increasing your primary weapon damage by 500%. If you have the perk Tempered Benison unlocked, the Cogron Tauron strike will also trigger an undescribed effect that for the next 30 seconds after casting your Tauron strike will cause every damage instance done to enemies to strip their defenses. Since a bunch of tornadoes can deal a ton of damage instances per second, practically all enemies around you will become stripped of their defenses. Then, while the other Tektolyst weapons for Vazarin, Naramon and Sunuric are fine to use too, there's no real huge synergies that they can provide for Zephyr and her base kit. However, the Nidri Tektolyst weapon from the Vazarin Focus School can also be quite helpful if you want to build around Pyrotechnics, as the Nidri is able to increase status damage done to enemies within a certain range. Okay, so now that I have explained most of Zephyr's characteristics, let's dive into some builds that you can use to dominate Steel Path. I will have each build timestamped so that you can easily find it back in the future, or to skip builds that you are not particularly interested in. The first build I want to share is a beginner build. This build is specifically made for players who have limited resources and access to regular Zephyr only. This build and weapons will require the most limited amount of resources and time invested and should be relatively easy to get going as a complete beginner to Warframe. The Zephyr build I will show on screen right now will require no Forma and no Orokin Reactor and uses the base version of Zephyr. Nonetheless, using the right synergies, this build can still deal ridiculous amounts of damage, as all of that comes from the damage replication via tornadoes. In terms of how to play this build, you're looking to keep up Turbulence as much as possible, since this is how you survive. Make sure to stay in the air whenever possible, as this takes you out of range from melee units that, together with Xmas units, pose the only real threat to you. Then, whenever you have energy to spare, cast your tornadoes into a group of enemies that run towards you. I prefer casting static tornadoes in a spot where you know that enemies will clump together, but using wandering tornadoes is fine as well. It's up to your preference. If you want to speed up this process, you can also cast the grouping version of Airburst, but make sure you only do so if you have ample energy. When enemies are collected inside of your tornadoes, you can either shoot the tornadoes, or you can slam the tornadoes with, for instance, this MK1 bow build, that is a little bit more investment, but will deal more than enough damage to carry you towards unlocking the Steel Path difficulty. This melee build is specifically designed to be used in tandem with your tornadoes and damage replication, so make sure tornadoes are used. Also make sure you include the Saxon mod that I used, which you can get from the Cambion Drift on Deimos. This mod is pretty much mandatory as it gives access to level scaling damage, which is incredibly potent. Remember that to get full damage on heavy slam attacks, you need to gain some height by bullet jumping in the air. For companions, it doesn't really matter what you choose, as we're not yet in the territory of fully min-maxed synergies with this build. So just use whatever companion you have currently unlocked and have a build for, or just use whatever you are comfortable with. To further progress this Zephyr build specifically, I would try to slowly upgrade it towards this one, where you include a little bit more options for energy regeneration and the augment mod Funnel Clouds for the most damage output possible. Do note that using the Funnel Clouds augment mod causes you to lose the innate crowd control capability of Tornado. But remember that you can still trigger this via the use of Airburst and its grouping version. You can then also go towards using the Sampotes instead of the MK1 bow, as the Sampotes is a much superior slam weapon that can be used all the way towards endgame. Also, once you are able to get it, Rolling Guard is advised since it allows you to clear status effects from Xmas units that might be able to deal significant damage to you otherwise. In this build I also put Nera's Anguish in the Exilus slot to increase overall slam damage. But this is in no way required, so feel free to save on some platinum or crafting materials if you want. Finally, for Arcanes, most of my Zephyr builds use Arcane Steadfast, which in my eyes is 100% worth the investment. Besides this, I can recommend the use of the new Arcane Concentration. This arcane will increase your duration on your abilities by another 60%. Do keep in mind that the ability you want to have this 60% extra duration on needs to be cast after another ability. So for instance, if you want 60% more duration on your Turbulence, make sure you cast something like Airburst before you cast Turbulence. For the focus school, I would recommend beginners to use Unairu, as this gives stagger immunity after transference back into your frame. This allows you to forego the use of Primed Sure-Footed, which as a beginner you will most likely not have. If you are watching this and the term focus school means nothing to you at all, don't even bother, as it is not that important for this build specifically. Then for the next build, I fully focus on Zephyr's Tornado ability, and I try to maximize the damage as much as possible. To fully understand this build, and as I wanted to reduce the length of this video, I would again recommend watching the Tornado video to get up to speed with the mechanics of this ability. The build I show will need a ton more investment than the beginner build from before, so beware. For the Tornado build, you can consider using multiple subsumes, depending on what you want to achieve and which playstyle you like. Zata's Whisper gives a ridiculous increase to our Tornado damage through damage replication. This will generally be the most powerful subsume that you can run, and you can use this across different playstyles. Then if you want a more melee focused playstyle, I can recommend Shock and the Shock Trooper Augment, as I said before, since this is incredible to activate melee influence on melee builds. Then if you want to make sure you can abuse the blast damage and tornado interaction, Thermal Sunder is also an incredible subsume ability. Just make sure that you use the Thermal Transfer Augment to give any weapon the ability to deal blast damage without having to mod for it. This build can be seen as a platform for Zephyr to use powerful weapons, however you can consider two versions of the platform according to your favorite playstyle. First, I will cover a mod setup that's more for melee and slamming. In this case, I would recommend this version, where I use Ready Steel as the Aura mod and the Nira mod set to get a big increase to slam damage. Also note the inclusion of Archon mods in this fully invested build, as tornadoes are able to deal elemental damage, and the elemental damage dealt by tornadoes can trigger Archon mods. I then use Molt Augmented instead of Arcane Concentration, due to the fact that we can buff damage multiplicatively by increasing our Zata's Whisper damage. I also use the Funnel Clouds Augment again, which is paramount to getting up to trillions of damage, since there's 11 tornadoes replicating our initial damage. If you are not big into slamming and you want to use weapons instead, you can also change the build to be this. Here there's also one slot that is empty, which is a flex slot to include whatever mod you like. If you enjoy using secondary weapons, you can use Airburst rounds. If you need more movement speed and projectile speed, you can use Jetstream. Or you can even throw on more ability strength. It's completely up to you what you want. I will note here that if you want to use the Shock or Thermal Sunder subsumes, this is the slot where you put either Shock Trooper or Thermal Transfer. Builds I can recommend for using Shock Trooper or Thermal Transfer are as follows, where I use more ability strength for both Thermal Sunder and Shock builds via the inclusion of Umbral Intensify. And for the Shock Trooper build specifically, I also use Arcane Fury for more melee damage. You can then pair these tornado-oriented builds with any weapon that has the following: weapons that have health scaling damage upon elimination, weapons with Incarnon effects that trigger after eliminations, or weapons with large AoEs and the ability to deal blast damage. A fully invested build, of course, also uses Archon Shards. So let's go over those next. For this build, Archon Shards can actually help improve this build by a lot. As the animation of Tornado is pretty long and we recast it quite often to set up new death zones for enemies, having additional cast speed is almost mandatory. To this extent, I slotted 2 Archon Shards for cast speed, and I left the other 3 slots open for you to choose. I can recommend more duration, so you have more uptime on your Turbulence, but in case you go for synergies like with the Kufa Sobek and Acid Shells, you can also consider the use of Violet Shards for additional electricity damage on your primary weapon. If you instead want to slam your heart out, using 3 Violets for melee critical damage is also very good. Just make sure that the total energy you have on your Zephyr build in this case is larger than 500, so you can double the critical damage that you get from the Violet Shards. Companions for this build again do not matter that much. In general, you can choose whatever you have or whatever you like using. The next build is something that I've already featured on the channel before, almost 2 years ago now. But this is an updated variant that I want to show, and it focuses on abusing the Target Fixation infinite stacking bug. The only thing we really want to build for on this build is range, as it helps us hit as many enemies as possible per Divebomb that we cast. Since we keep the damage buff, the loss in ability strength from the use of Overextended can be compensated with just using Molt Augmented. Then next we focus on survivability. To this extent, I build for ability duration, so there's high uptime on Turbulence, and I subsume Silence from Banshee over Zephyr's Airburst. Silence will deal with annoying abilities from Acolytes and Xmas units, and makes it way easier to stay alive. Primed Sure-Footed is recommended, so you are less likely to be stunned and killed by melee units. However, if you don't have Primed Sure-Footed yet, you can get away with using a Dante Spectre that can give you Overguard and thus provide you with stagger immunity. Alternatively, you can also summon an Arc Gun, which will give you some Overguard, or you can use Secondary Fortifier on a secondary weapon. I can especially recommend the use of the Azima for this, as you can shoot the alternate fire, which will give you passive Overguard, while you continue dropping nukes by face planting into the ground. I explained how to trigger the target fixation bug earlier in the video during the discussion of this augment. So if you need a refresher, or if you skipped towards this part of the video, just skip back to the target fixation part. Weapon choices for this build are a little more restrictive than on other builds I've shown so far. For the primary, you are free to use whatever, and I would recommend choosing something that can deal with Acolytes. For the secondary, I would highly recommend using this Grimoire build that helps with increasing your damage while you are still building up your buff. And for the melee, the use of the Praedos with its Incarnon perks to increase your parkour velocity are unmatched, as triggering dive bombs from higher up in the air will cause you to deal much more damage, so parkour velocity is king. For the focus school, I would highly recommend the use of Unairu, as access to the Cogron Tauron strike will help a lot with stripping defenses, as well as giving 4 oh shit buttons to instantly gain a bunch of health, energy and armor, and scaling damage in a large AoE. The gameplay loop for this ability is incredibly easy, as you just have to enable the target fixation bug, then keep up your Turbulence ability, bullet jump up into the air and cast your dive bombs. Then, if you need extra damage, cast tornadoes and dive bomb into said tornadoes. The synergy between dive bomb and tornadoes is especially useful to deal with threats like Acolytes. The final build I then want to share is for exploiting the interaction between Pyrotechnics from Temple and the ragdolls that Zephyr has access to via her Airburst as well as Tornado. To get this build going, you will need a couple of things. First, a weapon to deal with Acolytes again. Then you need a weapon that enables Heat Inherit. I prefer either the regular or Coda version of the Pox for this, as it spawns lingering AoEs that can prime enemies with heat procs. If you then also mod for Viral on your Pox, you immediately increase the damage potential of these heat procs. The final thing you then need is the Hate melee weapon with the Burning Hate Augment. This weapon will increase status damage by another 120% after hitting enemies that are on fire. Also make sure you equip the Zit on Uskos Tektolyst Arcane for 250% more heat damage on your secondary to increase the heat inherit potential. Using either a Citrine or Dante Spectre will also help, as Citrine will increase the duration of status effects on enemies, whereas Dante will give you both Overguard and further status damage increase via his Page Flight ability. The companion that you choose does not really matter that much, so use whatever you are comfortable with. In terms of Archon shards, I can recommend using 3 for ability strength to increase the damage and the total amount of pillars that Pyrotechnics is able to spawn. I then also use 2 ability cast speed shards again to make everything feel nice and smooth to play. The final build for this damage combo will look like this, where in a rare case I do not use the Funnel Clouds augment and we actually need the normal tornadoes to pick up and ragdoll enemies instead. The gameplay loop for this build is also a little bit more complicated than before, as you need to know the order in which you trigger each piece of the Heat Inherit puzzle. First, you need to throw your Coda Pox on the ground, then you cast either your Tornadoes or Airburst in the exact same spot to ragdoll enemies, then you continue to hit them once with the Hate melee weapon to trigger the Burning Hate augment, and then you continue to cast Pyrotechnics until you see your enemies succumb to your ludicrously buffed heat damage procs. In lower levels, on normal path, just casting Pyrotechnics is already good enough to wipe tiles, and even on steel path, enemies on the starting levels will not live through your entire combo. If you do, however, use this build for speed farming on lower levels, I would recommend using Preparation alongside Primed Flow, so you can start out missions with a large energy pool to spam Pyrotechnics with. Hi, Casey from the future here. So this is where the outro originally would have started for this video. However, due to the fact that I started this project over 5 months ago now, a lot has changed in Warframe, and I also realized along the way that I forgot certain bits of important information. So in an effort to not miss some more cool synergies and factoids that I should have added into this video in the first place, I will add this appendix where I will quickly cover what I think I missed. I'm sure that for some this will still not have covered everything that they wanted me to explain about Zephyr, and if you think that there's something that I definitely should have shared, please let me know in the comments down below. But for now, let's get into it. The first thing that I missed is the hidden Zephyr Flappy Bird minigame that you can access by going into this Z in your appearances menu. This is pretty much the same as the phone game from 2013 and also just as frustrating. Also, since making this video, we've had the introduction of some new arcanes and incarnon weapons, and I want to highlight some synergies here. First, I missed covering the fact that grouping enemies with Airburst also opens them up to ground finishers. This is especially helpful for building up your melee crescendo for initial combo, or for dealing massive damage with the new Obex Incarnon, which will spawn AoE damage when enemies are killed by finishers, including these ground finishers. The Obex Incarnon is now also a good option to run on Target Fixation builds, as it can give a ton of parkour velocity. Then I want to highlight what I think is a bug with the new Arcane Sculptor. The tornadoes that Zephyr creates realistically should be objects, which means that Arcane Sculptor should trigger, but it currently doesn't. So DE, please, for all of the burp lovers out there, look into this. There's also a new melee arcane called Melee Assimilation that will restore a percentage of your shields upon heavy attack kills after your shield has been broken. This arcane is absolutely nuts on Zephyr, as you will already have more than enough damage anyway whenever you are slamming into tornadoes. Oh yeah, and remember that on-kill effects will be replicated by tornadoes, enabling you to instantly reset your shield gates, increasing survivability of Zephyr even more. What I also missed to describe is that if an enemy can't be directly picked up via tornadoes, they will get a slow effect applied on them. This is especially useful for slowing down acolytes. Finally, I want to mention a mistake which I spotted during editing, which is where I said that the Nidri Tektolyst weapon can increase status damage. This is false, as it will only increase the chance for status procs to be applied, which can sometimes result in more status damage being done. However, this effect is more similar to the Tau status effect, and not things like the Burning Hate Augment mod, which is a separate multiplier for status damage entirely. Anyhow, with those things now out of the way, I will give it back to Casey in the past to close out the video. So yeah, that sums up pretty much all you need to know about Zephyr. She is an amazingly underrated frame that has incredibly high potential for a ton of different mission types. After watching this video, combined with the earlier video I made about the tornado ability, you should now be equipped with more than enough knowledge to make some borderline exploitative builds for her that can carry you through the entire game. Let me know what you think about Zephyr down in the comments and tell me if I missed anything. Anyhow, with all of that being said, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like and possibly subscribe for more in-depth Warframe content in your feed, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Bye. Finally, a massive thanks to all of these YouTube members that stuck with me throughout a period without any uploads. Your support is immensely valued and kept me motivated to bring out this massive video project on Zephyr. Much more shorter and simpler content will be on the way, with another massive video planned for a couple months down the line. But as I said, thank you for sticking with me.